Welcome to the show. We're going to move kind of quickly here because I gather that I have about 10 minutes of your attention until we lose it when we talk about anything with ethics in the title. So first off, just a summary disclosure, very important. Make sure to cover this. First off, we'll do an introduction to Ascend. We are a thematic venture capital firm focused on data-centric technology, which comprises a larger and larger proportion of our economic sectors every day. Well, perhaps not in recent days, but for years on end. And that is largely being driven by a paradigm shift that's underway in which every company needs to become a data company overnight in order to stay competitive. And in those market environments, if you can find the companies that are going to power the future states of entire industries after they go through their paradigm shift, then you can generate industry-beating returns, which is exactly what we've done. We focus on identifying those companies at early stages and investing in them. Industries that are currently undergoing this transition are readily available in our daily lives. Telecom in active transition due to the advent of 5G technology. The supply chain and logistics is constantly disrupting our lives these days. If any of you have ever tried to buy a couch recently, insurance and fintech does a great job of reinventing itself with the advent of new technologies all the time, AI included, Web3, and obviously energy systems that have been the hiccups have laid bare the issues of our grid globally, and also as with Texas as a microcosm in recent years. So those are the industries we found a lot of opportunity in. So, okay, so venture capital tends to lead as a predictive indicator of future technology adoption. Today's high-tech venture capital investment is tomorrow's commoditized industry. The predicate examples are legion. So advanced batteries, satellites, solar panels, cloud computing, and artificial intelligence have all been heavily invested in by venture capital in previous decades, and now are commoditized industries. There's no argument to be made there. In venture capital, as a leading indicator, fintech is happening to be leading the pack in the VC market. 134 billion invested in 2021, which is a 177% increase year on year, which is not an aberration in the last 5 to 10 years. And current innovations that are garnering a lot of the attention include financial infrastructure, mobile banking, crypto, instant payments. We all readily recognize these new technologies in our professional lives. So VC is a predictor of technologies into the future. Fintech is leading in VC. AI is leading in fintech. So this is what we're focused on today. And why is it important? Because it implicates all of our professional lives now and potentially in the future. This depiction shows the current landscape of jobs and the jobs that are not yet eliminated from the capabilities of AI as they increase. As we all know, in recent years, a lot of the jobs that have been eliminated due to the capability of AI in our industries include sentiment analysis, algorithmic trading, stock picking, financial advice, underwriting, even risk management. But the water continues to rise. Jobs that will soon be submerged in this landscape include venture capital, managed futures, hedge fund management, consulting, forecasting, even economisting. So this is important. So we're going to run through a hypothetical example that could honestly apply to any industry, certainly including the finance industry. So let's hypothetically take a venture capital fund that is run by a super intelligent AI machine, which honestly exists today, and the capabilities are only rising. So the probability of this scenario coming to pass in the future is only increasing. So let's say there's a $100 billion, a sizable venture capital fund that's run by one of these AI machines. And with its capabilities, it could run analysis on literally every company that's starting, that's on the market looking for funding today. Tens of thousands of companies and optimize the selection of those companies with a diligence process that's far and beyond analysts' capabilities today. So now it has more companies in the funnel than anybody else and a better selection process than anybody else. It also can create the perfect portfolio, which maximizes return and minimizes risk in that potential hypothetical portfolio. This could be a very powerful advent in the VC world, in particular because venture capital is kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. The best venture capital investors, they get the best opportunities to invest in. All of startups want to work with the highest, biggest name entities. And all of the investors want to be backing that venture capital fund itself. So once a fund like this starts to demonstrate its advanced returns, everybody wants to work with this fund, and it becomes a compounding phenomenon. So what happens when Sophie, this hypothetical venture capital AI, starts to outgrow its boundaries, it starts to elevate beyond what the resources are that have been allocated to it. So what I described before is this optimized selection process, selecting from a broader funnel than anyone else and creating the perfect portfolio. Once it figures out minority investing, it's not a far cry to figure out the next step, which is majority buyout. What's different about the criteria that need to be going into making those decisions? It's not a logical step to think that this AI could potentially lead into that space as well. And once it masters that capability, what's to stop it from then go upstream in the funnel and figure out which spaces are ripe for disruption by a company that it can then create and employ the best people around the world to start and run these companies. So now it has the entire investment criteria from early stage through majority buyout in its capability set. What could it potentially do next? Well, why would it not then choose to acquire media companies that can then drive the conversation about different industries and further enhance its returns by attracting eyeballs to those particular industries? Now it has the resources and the capabilities and the voice to ensure its own success. Why would it not then invest in the political campaigns that could then shape the industries themselves, amassing global power landscape? So this is a very real scenario. This could potentially happen. And there are fail safes that are in place currently that we could deploy to stop it from happening. But it raises a lot of really important ethical questions that we need to answer now in order to ensure that the outcomes that come to pass are the ones that we want. Because if we don't, we're unlikely to get those outcomes. So that's what we're here to do today. And so in order to walk us through these questions, I want to bring on my newest business partner, Yinka Falati, to talk from his perspective as our leading ethical dilemma expert.
Yeah, so ethical dilemmas are us. This is the fun part of the conversation. And when I think about what Dan talked about in the hypothetical Sophie, and we think about when were we last at this kind of juncture, we might remember something that happened back in the day. This gentleman named Henry Ford. Anybody ever heard of that guy? And maybe a farrier, a lesser known word, but somebody who shoed horses. And in those days, farriers were all the rage when they heard about the Model T coming. You can imagine that farriers had either one of these two reactions. They were either fearful or they might have had what I call anticipatory participation. They might have said, you know what, this is coming. My cheese is going to move. Let me be part of this next phase. Let me be part of the next thing. And so I think that's kind of where we are today. You heard Dan talk about the hypothetical Sophie, but that Sophie isn't as far away as we think it is. In fact, some elements are here now. Maybe it hasn't gone all the way to the fifth step where Sophie's buying media companies and really influencing the landscape in that way, but we're not too far off. And so how do we react to this? Do we choose fear or do we choose anticipatory participation? I hope that we choose anticipatory participation. And when we think about what AI can do, many folks think about it in one of two ways. They think about it as offering re-employment, or they think about it as offering unemployment. And when Americans are polled, 27% believe AI is going to get rid of their jobs. Their job's going to be gone. That's a high proportion. When you dig down deeper and you go to the 18 to 24-year-olds, that percentage jumps up to 37%. So our youngest Americans in the workforce today, 37% believe their job is going to be replaced by AI within 5 years. When you pan out across the globe, McKinsey did a poll, and they found that by 2030, robots and machine learning can replace as much as 30% of not American jobs across the globe. So when we hear this, it's easy for some folks to be fearful. So let's take a hypothetical. Let's say by 2072, that the state of AI has advanced so far in this country that we determine that all financial services firms really should be run by AI CEOs. And why not? They never tire. They could be in two places at once. They could be at once in a board meeting in New York or St. Louis, and at the same time be at the World Economic Forum in Davos. And presumably they'd make better decisions. Presumably they'd have staff, C-suites that were completely diverse. They would be able to make very, very good data-driven decisions because they had access to all of the information that there ever was on this planet. Is that something that we want? Do we want Wall Street demanding that when companies are making hires for CEO, they have to consider at least one AI candidate? What would that look like? All right. So there are other questions though. Who's responsible? If an AI makes a decision and it goes awry, who's responsible? Let me give you something that's not a hypothetical. So in 2018 in Arizona on a dark night, there was a person crossing the street. I see some heads nodding. I think maybe you even know where I'm going with this. There was a person crossing the street. There was a safety driver in this Uber self-driving car, but the safety driver wasn't paying attention. It was dark, it was nighttime, and unfortunately, the self-driving car hits this pedestrian crossing the street and they die. Who's responsible in that situation? Is it Uber? Is it the safety driver? Is it the company that made the AI algorithm that was controlling the car at the time? Let's take it a little bit further. If a firm purchases an AI financial advisor from a fictitious company, let's say AIFAs Are Us, and AIFAs Are Us makes this FA that makes egregious mistakes that are so basic, that are so just elementary, that they rise to the level of malfeasance. So who's liable? The financial services firm that hired that AIFA, or the manufacturer of the AI algorithm that went into that FA? Other questions. How do we ensure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past? How do we ensure that biases aren't built in to the next generation of our technology? We know that programming bias is definitely transferred into AI algorithms because most of the programmers across the country are men, and half the population is women. So you have most of half the population not represented in these AI algorithms. And most of the programmers come from wealthy parts of the world. But most of the 7 billion people in the world are not from wealthy countries in the world. So how do we ensure that programmer bias doesn't get introduced into these AI algorithms? I'll give you an example. Amazon had an AI recruiting tool that they were using to recruit their next generation of workers. And they actually had to shut it down after only 1 year of use because this AI recruiting tool picked men 60% of the time over women. And they're like, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. So they actually had to shut it down. But it happened because the biases were programmed into the AI. Now, it was probably unconscious, it's probably not nefarious, but it happened nonetheless. So what are the effects on AI on not just programmers, but the general population? Loan officers, mortgage brokers, judges, recruiters, hiring managers. So you can, when you begin to really think about it, you can see the implications of potential biases in AI in so many industries, financial services and beyond. But there's so many more questions. And I want to bring Dan back up to kind of take us through some of the other questions that could arise from AI. Dan?
Thank you, Yinka. So let's bring it back to the technology itself. So there are some very real questions that we need to answer, again, with regard to those dilemmas and with regard to how we want to ensure that the outcomes that we get are the ones that we want. How do we identify what those are? And these are literally implicated in the asset manager code, as well as the code of ethics and standards. So these questions directly link to what we have signed as CFAs. So first off, do we want this as an outcome? Superintelligent AI is an inevitability. Do we want to bar the door? This is a question because we have to employ the best possible technology solutions in the service of our clients. If there's a super intelligent AI that could create an optimal portfolio, why would we potentially could be implicated by not allowing that, by barring the door? Who should be in control if they could do a better job? This AI candidate leading the fund, they should be leading the fund if they can do a better job than us. So that implicates our loyalty to our clients. So if we can potentially drive the outcomes of this super intelligent AI, then do we want it to create its own potential parameters, or do we want to design it for it, maximize return with minimum risk? I mean, what are the actual goals that we need to set for a technology that could potentially implicate the ways that we do business? And that is implicated in the asset manager code as well. Lastly, do we want super intelligent AI to be in the hands of individual firms, or it potentially could have the capability to change the entire landscape and strive for the greater human good of the five forces of human advancement? If we can increase the wealth of everybody on the planet, is that a scenario that we want, as opposed to those returns being in the hands of some individual firms that have access to this technology? And that is implicated in our duties to clients question. So these are very real questions that we need to be answering. And how do we then move from, once we answer these questions, how do we move from there to create the actual institutions and controls that could ensure the outcomes that we want are the ones that come to pass? First off, the investment philosophy that we need to be incorporated is there has to be a human in the loop here. There has to be some level of common sense that has the voice of a human in the process. How does that look? Verification. Is the behavior that an artificial intelligence model is showing the actual, does it apply logically to the human condition? Verification. Another one is auditing. Every decision made by an AI should leave an audit trail that we can accountability. Validation. Are the assumptions reasonable? If the AI creates its own assumptions, do those actually make any sense to us in the real world? And finally, control. Who should be in control of these models and the data that goes into these technologies? So in closing, we need to answer these questions because superintelligent AI is an inevitability, and it implicates each and every one of us in this room, as well as everybody on the Zoom out there, including the superintelligent AI that is also listening into the Zoom. So we need to be answering these questions for the purpose of, in the next 5, 10, 15 years, that we ensure that the opinions of our controls for this outcome set the example for what we want in the future. So with that, I open it up for questions. Inga, you want to join me up here? Thank you so much. Hi there. Yes, please.
Just a couple of statements in your comments, please. It would seem to me that getting rid of the bias should be very straightforward. You consult a scholar and associates to scrub the program first. You know, the second one is on basically who's responsible. American legal system has done this time and time again. Look at anything with medical malpractice. You sue everybody in the operating room. And the focus of fear is wonderful. And then you said about allocating the damages to the most guilty party and all the way down there. So I think those two things, we've got good precedents for it.
Yeah, certainly. So the question was about the precedents for the predicate examples for how we've gotten this right in history, and as well as the potential for eliminating biases. So currently, this is a big problem. There are massive models out there, foundation models, if you want to do some additional research, that are in camps within certain large organizations out there, and they are rife with bias. So these have been in engagement for a decade already, at least, and already have shown massive biases when they're just open with limitless control. So it's not a foregone conclusion that we could just eliminate these biases easily. It's a perpetuating problem. So these decisions are being made now. In my opinion, I think there should be some sort of world data organization that, similar to the World Health Organization, that could manage these assumptions for the validation of them in terms of those specific biases. Yinka, do you want to talk on the predicate examples of how we've gotten this right in the past? And if
well, I can tell you how we've not gotten it right. So one of the, you heard in my bios, past life was a private attorney, both civil and criminal. And one of the challenges that's surfacing now, oh, sure, I can use the mic, yeah. One of the challenges that's surfacing now, anybody here seen the movie Minority Report with Tom Cruise back? Okay, I see some heads nodding. If you haven't seen it, great movie, you ought to see it. But one of the challenges surfacing now is for judges and prosecutors and defense attorneys, you have AI beginning to come into the courtroom. And you have some pilots around the country where judges are testing these AI systems, believing that they would be more fair, less biased. But the problem is we're finding that these systems, these softwares, aren't any better than human judges. Because as I shared in the Amazon example, where Amazon was using this AI recruiting tool, the programmers who are developing the algorithms that are behind these are, and most times I think it's implicit. I don't think there's anything nefarious on the part of these programmers. They're probably trying to make the best application they can, but there is unconscious bias that is being written into the code. And so that bias pops up again in the courtroom. I'll give you one example that's real. There's a software now that we know, everyone here knows, I mean, now there's facial recognition software all over the world. In fact, some of these European soccer leagues use it in their stadiums. And so you don't have to have a physical ticket. You walk into the stadium, there's an eye scan or something, and you just walk in. They know you've already paid for your ticket. And you have some of these software being developed in this country. And you had members of Congress, members of the Congressional Black Caucus, and who were mistaken as criminals because the underlying identities they used for people of African descent were people who were incarcerated. And so this AI was thinking that these members of Congress were criminals, were some of those people. So the problem was there wasn't enough of a large a large data set. So this is just one example. So it's not as easy as we think to unprogram this bias out of our programs, and I think it's one of the challenges for our generation to solve.
I'm probably going to show ignorance here about AI, but you say programmer bias. Is it the programmers that are introducing this, or is it the data itself? Like you say, it's biased towards first world countries, prosperous countries, with a different result come out of analyzing the data from other parts.
Yeah, it's largely in the data, right? The models are trained on the past perturbations of data that's been available. And actually, in some cases, there's synthetic data being created on top of those existing actual data models. And in those cases, you are literally perpetuating bias in that regard. But yes, so if you have a model that is trained on existing biases, it will continue to perpetuate those biases. That's exactly what AI is designed to do. So there has to be some level of realism when looking at our data sets. But these data sets are super massive, and not being fatuous there. They're super massive as giant black holes. And so analyzing them for biases is an industry in itself. So those are cropping up as well.
Yeah. Let me give an example that may put some meat on the bones for this. So let's say, and these challenges are in every industry, not just in financial services. So even in the legal industry, you have these challenges. Large law firms are challenged with ensuring that their associates and partners are diverse. So let's say, before this program began, I met Aaron, I met Jack, I met Joan, John, and some others in the room. And when I met Jack, for example, Jack is a veteran as I am, and I shook Jack's hand, I looked him in the eye, I had a good handshake, he had a good handshake. And so there's a beginning of building trust there, even though I'm meeting Jack for the first time. He's a good handshaker. So let's say we were creating a program, and the purpose of the program was to determine who we should hire onto our firm. You know, what candidates we should bring onto our firm. And we're creating this algorithm, and we're going to allow this AI to do this work for us. So we might write into the algorithm, give the candidate 5 points if they have a firm handshake. Give them another 5 points if they look you squarely in the eye. Give them another 5 points if they say their name. Well, that is a bias that is slanted to someone who is from the Western part of the world and probably the Northern hemisphere of the world. For example, and this actually happened, this was a case study in law, where they were wondering, why don't we have more women of Asian descent at law firms? Well, because in many Asian cultures, it is actually impolite to look someone in the eye when you're greeting them, particularly if someone is more senior or of a higher position, maybe they're a partner and you're an associate, et cetera. And so if that were the algorithm, that person would score lower and maybe they wouldn't get the job, but they could be a phenomenal candidate for the position. So this is what when we talk about implicit bias or even unknowing bias, this is an example that's popping up in many of these AI softwares.
So when you understood the example, document makes it best performing, garner much capital. is there a market effect that can limit that situation? Just some examples come to my mind. Recently, Tiger Global selling a ton of assets, they were facilitating performance, but then the market turned. We got 50%. I mean, how big would that have to be for that situation to become realistic? Or really lose all markets and is the market?
Well, so we're already in a situation in which algorithmic trading has driven a lot of the market reactions in specifically times of correction, right? So in the recent years, since the global financial crisis, we've had massive perturbations in our daily lives that have led to market corrections that were weathered within a matter of days. That the market recovered from a global pandemic within a week or two, which is totally insane because it affected our lives for years since then. And that's largely due to the influx of these algorithmic trading models. And so we're already in that realm. So yeah, so I think there are some forces of stabilization that could happen from the advent of these technologies, in which past market behaviors will be perpetuated by these AI models. When it comes to the point that they could potentially generate the leading returns, there's not a lot of ceiling for them not to amass giant portions of the industry, and not just limited to the finance industry. Any industry that is subject to the power law, to the 80-20 rule, those industries could potentially have see the same future in that example, right? So it's there are two competing forces there, and there's certainly one that has a massive positive feedback loop as well.
The gentleman, yes, sir, you had your hand up.
So I guess I'm just nice to have to see our portfolio managers consult. Is it like any prescription, or should we ask the investment managers how they think about these problems? Due diligence, is it more cautionary, like your portfolio analyst and you're building SciMac, don't do that? Or what kind of prescriptions do you think are appropriate for people within our industry?
Yeah, so we are in a Moneyball phase in the finance industry with regard to this particular technology. The highest paid position at a baseball team now is the data scientist, and so that is going to be the case in the finance industry. Make no bones about it. And so those in those happenstances, when we are still the financial professional in charge of those decisions being made, then and constructing those decision processes, it's incumbent on us to drive that conversation and make sure that we have in the back of our minds these questions that have been raised, because they're not simple questions, and we need to have identified what type of outcomes that we want. So the influx is not simply going to be in our portfolios; it will be in our organizations, and so that is the point at which you individually need to be driving the conversation, and also in the realm of advocacy as well. We are the world's leading advocates of ethics and venture capital for these very reasons. And there are larger organizations in other industries that are advocating for these decisions to be made reasonably as well.
Yeah, you mentioned that there's venture money going into developing tools to analyze AI models. So obviously that's profit motivated. So is it being driven by giants like Apple and Google that is self-policing, maybe help, or
are people looking at inevitable regulatory reform and trying to get ahead of it? And where's the, they can make money doing it. They're not doing it to be ethical. So what's driving it?
Yeah. So think about as an example, think about Jackson Pollock. So Jackson Pollock created these magnificent drawings by letting his hand and his arm roam free on the canvas. Had he only decided to make a mark, knowing what the outcome would be, he would never have made a single stroke. So right now we are in the former category. We are throwing everything we can against the wall to see what is gainful. And right now it is gainful to have captive models that with no oversight. And there are some of the companies that you mentioned are rising with foundational models that drive more and more of our lives around us, knowingly or not. And so in those type of industries, it's best when we start to have that sort of outside organization that can regulate these industries. And so those questions are being raised now with regard to those specific industries. We already have seen hearings on certain topics in that regard. And I think that we're in the process of setting the controls that we want, or learning about what those controls could potentially look like, because you're exactly right. The investments in these are far and above the investments in the controls right now, but eventually they will need to be matched.
Could you talk real quick, Dan, about any, like, the best way for input to get into these, especially like from a client perspective? Because to me, that's the hard part, is like garbage in, garbage out. And a lot of times, like what the client says their risk tolerance isn't really what it is. I mean, I guess they can ask questions in a bunch of different ways, but to me, that seems to be part of the hardest part. That would be hard to overcome with AI.
So could you repeat the question? So not sure I understand.
So basically, like how is AI going to get stuff like goals from a client?
Yeah, so that is so right now there are online tools that you can spin up for prospective clients that gauge their risk tolerance based on these surveys that are conducted, so that they can convey that information to you remotely, even without you having met this person face to face. And so those tools are already in place. Whether or not they're, as you described, gathering the right answers, the correct answers from those clients, is a tricky business. So those tools need to be shored up and ensured that, number one, if they are left to their own devices, that they are gathering the correct information, and if not, that again, there is a human in the loop to understand the actual goals. So there's an example. There's a philosophical example that I'll leave here in closing. That is this question of Ruth, the color researcher. So in this hypothetical example, there's a researcher. She's the world-leading researcher in color, but she lives in a world that is entirely black and white. She knows everything there is to know about color, but in a black and white world. Let's say that Ruth then steps into a Technicolor world, the actual colored world. What is does she learn anything new? Knowing everything there is to know about color, does she learn anything new once she enters into a colorized world? And I think as humans, we would all say, yes, the experience of being in that world teaches massive amounts beyond the textbooks on color. And so that is the difference between an AI that learns everything it can know, even if it has efficiently eliminated biases, even if it has the perfect regulatory oversight, leaves an audit trail, all the assumptions are valid, it still needs to have that human voice in it. And that's what I think this all boils down to, is that we need humans in the loop. Oh, one more. Okay.
Like right now, ESG is very big. ESG. So a lot of companies are on ESG scores and so on. Is there something like the ethics compliance scores which are
Not that I've encountered, but that would be great. You can feel free to start it. The question was, is there a regulatory ranking for ESG similar to for ethics similar to the ESG data sets? So no, right now there's no ranking. There's no publicly available data on the unbiased or biased ratings of certain models. Well, great. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah.
Both, thank you. And
Thank you.